AEW is arguably a year old at this point, but that doesn't really matter. I only put that in the title because it sounded nice. Also, this isn't a grading list or something where I'm going to give them scores out of 10 or give them school grades or something. Again, it's just a clever title. We're just here to talk about how I think AEW is doing roughly a year into their run. I feel like AEW has had enough time to breathe and prove itself as a wrestling promotion for us to look back and talk about where they succeeded and where they failed in certain areas. I feel like there's a lot of personal disclaimers I need to go through before we can begin to explain my wrestling perspective, so I'll be as quick as possible. I'm 18 and was born after both WCW and ECW were dead. Later that year, in fact, I grew up in a world with only WWE until 2010 moving forward when I really got into TNA as a kid. 2011 TNA is still Kino as fuck wrestling. But WWE was primarily my only wrestling involvement besides TNA until 2018 when I got massively into New Japan. And since then, my wrestling experience has gotten significantly better. Gone were the days of complaining and bashing my head against a wall wondering why WWE was so unbelievably shit, as they ruined my favorite NXT guys one after another and continued to choose Charlotte over Sasha. All of a sudden I didn't care anymore because New Japan was number one and WWE was something I kept up with, but I just found the issues with WWE that used to frustrate me funny now. Something else had my attention. For a recent example, I thought The Fiend jobbing to Goldberg was hilarious. There was no malice in my heart because I stopped caring about WWE incessantly on January the 4th, 2018, the day I fell in love with Tetsuya Naito. I don't care about The Fiend. I stopped caring about Bray the last time we were in this position with Cena 6 years ago, and no, this will not make up for that. Bray needed it back then, but who cares? You are losing as a wrestling fan if you care about the WWE and allow yourself to get mad at their incessant fuck-ups. But wrestling was effectively saved for me when I got into New Japan. Wrestling was good, better than I ever could have asked. So AEW didn't have this intrinsic appeal to me, like it did to most other wrestling fans, I feel. It wasn't going to save wrestling because wrestling didn't need saving. So it took some winning over to make me an AEW fan, but eventually they got me. I enjoy watching Dynamite every week even more than NXT, and they have Io Shirai. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that I'm not a diehard AEW fan who thinks AEW is the best wrestling in the world, or has come to save wrestling in some sort of revolution. But I'm also not an NXT fan here to undercut AEW to be a contrarian, though I do love being a contrarian. I'm just a boy in the middle, not necessarily attached to either show, here to look at how AEW is going. Other than that, Sasha Banks is my favorite wrestler, and the best match I've ever seen is Naito vs Omega in the G1 final in 2017, or the Naito vs Okada match from this year's Tokyo Dome. Now that you understand me a little better and the disclaimers are all out of the way, let's talk about AEW's first year. We're going to start with the positives. And the one shining positive about AEW besides their ticket sales, that we'll actually touch on later in the negatives, is creating stars. The big names in AEW are stars to the AEW fans, and they have even succeeded in creating some megastars. These stars haven't necessarily been made from scratch. I hear people screaming that out from Full Sail University right now as I'm saying this, but that doesn't matter. Let's start off by talking about maybe my favorite current star in AEW and possibly AEW's biggest success story, the Hangman. The Hangman was that one guy from Ring of Honor in the tournament to crown the first IWGP US champion that no one cared about. He was taking a spot away from a New Japan talent that we actually wanted to see and actually cared about in the tournament. He was that one dude that got no reaction against Jay White and Walter Pyramid at Strong Style Evolved in 2018. He's Cody's friend that's around for some reason. This nuisance, this person we didn't care about, is now maybe the most over star in All Elite Wrestling, when he felt more like a sidekick before the company existed. The Hangman might be the biggest beneficiary of this company's existence. He's the biggest star that wasn't a star before AEW, and it's because he's fucking awesome. It wasn't all peaches and cream. His Jericho match wasn't the best, and he seemed to be destined to follow in Kenny's footsteps with no meaningful feud or storyline until they made him a drunk who doesn't give a fuck. And now everybody loves him. It's the ultimate portrayal of masculinity. He's not quite Steve Austin, but it's in that vein. He drinks beer, which endears him to the audience, and he beats the shit out of people, not giving a fuck about the consequences. It's the ultimate recipe for success, plus he's seemingly on his own as he alienates himself from his elite buddies. It's perfect, and it's no wonder that he got a bigger reaction than Kenny at Revolution. And this is important because as a New Japan fan, coming into AEW, I didn't really have a guy to get behind in AEW. In New Japan, I have my guys: Naito, Hiromu, Suzuki, Zack Sabre Jr., Ishii, Juice Robinson, David Finlay. In any given New Japan match, I have a guy I would prefer to go over, and that makes things inherently more interesting, because any sport is interesting if you choose a side. Even in WWE, if Sasha or Io are in a match, I'm inherently invested because those are my guys, or girls, or whatever. The closest thing I had to this in AEW was Christopher Daniels for a long time, because he's one of my all-time favorites. Yes, out of the old X Division 3, I'm a Daniels guy. But Daniels isn't exactly positioned to be having main events, where I can get invested in him going over. But now that problem is remedied because I consider the Hangman to be one of my guys. The beer drinking, not giving a fuck about these elite idiots, his independence, him being pissed off, the character he's morphed into is fantastic. And I mentioned it earlier, so let's talk about the best match in AEW history, that tag title match at Revolution with Kenny and the Hangman beating the Bucks. Not only is the Hangman better in terms of character work, promos, and his overall demeanor, but this was easily the best match I've ever seen of his. This was finally what I wanted, a New Japan epic in an AEW ring. All the other big AEW matches have been Cody matches that are mostly NWA homages, in classic Western wrestling style, or that terrible hardcore match. But finally, with the right guys in the right position with the right amount of time, AEW gave us a New Japan epic tag title match, something New Japan can't even do with its tag division. So overall, everything I'm seeing from the Hangman currently is fantastic, and AEW Hangman is better in every way than pre-AEW Hangman, which is all we could ask for. He's become a legitimate star that's in the heavyweight title picture like Kenny, Jericho, Moxley, and Cody, and he is a possible future face of the company. Another guy that AEW has bolstered and made a star out of is Darby Allen. Unlike the Hangman, before AEW I'd never even heard of Darby Allen, but just like the Hangman, he's now one of my guys in AEW. My favorite wrestler as a child was Jeff Hardy, and unlike certain other comparisons commentary likes to make to say Eddie Guerrero, the constant comparisons between Jeff Hardy and Darby Allen fit perfectly. Darby Allen has the same appeal Jeff Hardy did to me when I was younger to the kids in the AEW audience. He's become their Jeff Hardy. Darby is different, he's small, he's interesting, he's fearless, he does his own thing, and he's always the underdog. This is the recipe for success with a younger audience. But outside of that, he's just cool. The aesthetic, the entrance song, they're all great. And this all wins over the adult members of the audience, making him likable to everybody, and that's why he's as over as he is. The injury angle they did with him recently, that culminated in his return after a few weeks of absence, did wonders for him. Go back and listen to the pop as he makes the save in that segment. It's monumental. He's so over, he even got referenced in the newest JPEG Mafia song, Bald.
Look, I'm cashing out. Young Darby, I'm tagging it. They gon' bring your casket out. I hope that you fit in it. Ooh, what you...
Darby Allen joins the Hangman as an out-and-out star that AEW functionally created, and is one of the great success stories in the company's young history. Now let's take a look at the anomaly that is Cody. The fans that love Cody today in AEW hated him this time 2 years ago. Remember when Cody was the WWE guy that went to the indies and couldn't hang? Remember when New Japan's first tour on American soil happened and the cards were announced and everyone was furious that Okada's opponent for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship was Cody, a non-New Japan, non-Japanese talent? Remember when New Japan pulled the same shit and the next year Cody was Kenny's only title defense in America? He was the embodiment of New Japan watering down their American shows with American talent, not realizing that everyone just wanted to see Okada and Naito. We wanted an actual New Japan main event on American soil. Our fury was directed at Cody as he seemed to constantly get in the way of that. Not to mention 2 years ago, he was also the biggest heel in wrestling. On all of those American shows, he was booed out of the building. At Walter Period, opposite of G.O.D., he was booed. At the Cow Palace, opposite Kenny Omega, he was booed. Remember the Bullet Club is fine line he kept repeating as he tried to pull it apart from the inside? That was monster MJF level heat. But all that ended on one night on the first spiritual AEW show, All In, against Nick Aldis, where Cody won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. That night, Cody became a god to the hardcore Western wrestling fans, as he won his father's belt, and in their minds, he was the one that put this triumphant show together, since it was his bet with Meltzer that started the conversation around this show. Then his reputation with the fans was only bolstered as he became the face of the idea that eventually became AEW. He is the face of AEW, he's become the figurehead. He's both sides of Triple H that people love, the on-top superstar and the wise fatherly behind-the-scenes guy who creates stars without, the negatives, mainly his lack of reputation with a shovel. Cody is, by far, to me, the single biggest star AEW has created. The Hangman is still getting there, but this is undeniable to me. I know I didn't view Cody as a superstar until AEW, and I don't think most of you did either, but he is the face of AEW, more than Jericho, more than Moxley. He really is in the position I think a lot of us thought Kenny Omega was going to be in when the company came into being. He's the guy that you come to see. He's proven this with his feud with Jericho, where all of a sudden he was cutting the best promos we had seen on a US wrestling show in years. He's a megastar, or at least he feels like one, because everything he's touched so far in AEW has been gold. Darby Allen, who we went over earlier, started as a Cody pet project at Fyter Fest. MJF, though we'll talk about him later, is another success story that can largely be attributed to Cody. Not only that, he's rejuvenating careers as now his brother, after a fantastic feud and match with Cody, feels more like a star than he has felt like in 20 years in AEW. He's got the megastar entrances that are all great, yes, all of them. And just think about all the great Cody segments we've seen and just compare them to anyone but Jericho, and no one has delivered as much since the very beginning as Cody. The whipping segment, the cage match with Wardlow, all the promos. When Cody is on screen, something important or something great is happening, and you're watching it. There was even a time until recently when Kenny Omega remembered he was that good, that Cody was constantly having the best matches in AEW, which is something no one saw coming. Again, that Dustin match was incredible. And before AEW and All In, Cody couldn't have a great epic main event match to save his life. The Okada and Omega main events were disappointing to everybody, because the understanding amongst fans was that Cody was a WWE guy and WWE guys can't go here, they aren't good enough. But eventually Cody proved them wrong. Cody is the Triple H of AEW in all the best ways, and maybe even a better babyface promo. Though Hunter was always a heel promo, trust me, Hunter was great. Go back and watch him during his reign of terror. If nothing else, he was a great promo. Cody is a god to the AEW audience, and honestly, it still surprises me how great he's become. Chris Jericho did it again. He reinvented himself, and it succeeded massively. Jericho seemed to understand that in WWE he was going to be reserved to a limited veteran role, where he'd put people over, handing away his spotlight onto the next generation as he walked off into the sunset. And he decided that he is still a main event caliber talent. And it wasn't until he had the first Tokyo Dome match with Kenny that I think we collectively realized what Jericho had to have been thinking the entire time. He's still a megastar. Jericho still has value as a legitimate top guy, not just a guy that puts people over and loses all the time, but as a guy that a brand can be built around with the name recognition to do it. And that's what he's done with AEW. Just like Cody, everything Jericho touches in AEW seems to turn to gold. His latest run as AEW's first World Heavyweight Champion has been beneficial for everybody involved. Jericho has gotten to be the top guy in a major promotion again, probably more than he ever had been before, so I'm sure it was fun for him while he got free reign with creative. But he also built up the people around him. Just look at the Inner Circle. Jack Swagger was a loser. Jake Hager is a monster. Jericho did that. All the members of the Inner Circle are now stars by default because of their association with Jericho, and that's the same for everybody that he's gone against as well. He's done great pieces of business with Scorpio Sky, Jungle Boy, and Darby Allen that elevated all of them individually just working opposite of Jericho. Not to mention what that experience must mean for them professionally. And he even finally achieved his lifelong goal of getting Fozzy over with a wrestling audience. I look forward to the crowd singing Judas every week on Dynamite more than I look forward to nearly anything else on the show. This must create an unbelievable atmosphere in the buildings, and it has to be great for Jericho as he walks to the ring. I personally think we should be singing everyone's songs as they come to the ring. If I were to ever go to an AEW event, singing Judas in unison with thousands of people, I'd imagine would probably be one of the highlights of the night and just about the greatest feeling in the world. I envy anyone that gets to do it. Jericho, like Cody, is a megastar in AEW, and whenever he's on screen, he has your utmost attention also. And he is another massive success story coming out of AEW's first year. But now let's get into some criticism. Now that we've touched on all the biggest success stories in AEW, I think it's time for some criticism. Let's start with maybe the most heavily criticized aspect of AEW, the women's division. If there's one aspect that nearly everyone agrees on about the NXT versus AEW war, it's that NXT destroys them in terms of women's divisions. I've mentioned that I'm a massive fan of Io Shirai, but outside of her, they have Rhea Ripley, who's not one of my favorites but is a big star. They have Bianca Belair, who's great and a big personality. They have Toni Storm when she comes around, who's amazing as well. And And they have Tegan Nox and Dakota Kai, who themselves are stars in the making, rounding out quite a solid roster that is still actively making other stars. NXT's women's division is finally free of boring Asuka and Shayna Baszler matches that have polluted the division since Sasha and Charlotte left 5 years ago, and it is great. But AEW's women's division up until quite recently was lifeless with no actual stars. I think all of the problems in the AEW women's division are because of one issue. The girls never get promo time. This has started changing recently, most notably and to great effect with Britt Baker, who's delivering weekly great promos that have gotten her more over in 2 months than anyone in the entire division has gotten over wrestling for over a year. Let me make this clear, AEW to me is primarily a promo company. Everything I've liked the most about this company, besides that outstanding tag match, has been promo related. The in-ring or in-arena promos are the one thing that I think TV wrestling undeniably has over tour wrestling, which I think is preferable in every other way. Think about it, the Cody promos, the Jericho promos, the Hangman promos, the recent outstanding Jake the Snake promo, these are where AEW shines the most, and the women's division just hasn't gotten this opportunity yet, and it's a massive mistake. Now, AEW cornered themselves into this position with some of the decisions they made in the early stages of the division. Riho was chosen to be the first AEW Women's Champion, and I'm assuming she doesn't know enough English to cut convincing promos. So already your top feud in the division can't have promos to build the matches. Britt Baker, who's become a great promo, was initially booked as the white girl American babyface, who's also a doctor, and her promos weren't inspiring anything either. Shida, who the company has seemed to be getting behind as the next big star of the women's division, runs into the same problem as Riho with the language barrier. And Chris Statlander, I think, is supposed to be a mute, so that doesn't help either. And because of all this, none of the women connected with the audience as much as the company would have hoped. Riho was over, but it was because she was champion and got a majority of the focus. But she wasn't even on the level of a Darby Allen or an SCU in overall popularity. Brandy, who could have helped out in this area as she is a good promo, was stuck doing whatever the Nightmare Collective turned out to be, and now that storyline has been dropped and Awesome Kong left to go film the next season of Glow. So in the women's division, along with the booking being probably unintentionally 50-50, Ashida was beating everyone and is now constantly getting beaten by whoever they want to challenge for the belt next. AEW has tried a bunch of things that have fallen flat and hurt the standing of a lot of the girls involved. And people don't care about their matches because the girls don't get promo time like the guys do. Though things seem to be getting better as of recently. The women have been getting more mic time as of recently, with Nyla cutting some pretty good promos, and Big Swole overall has been quite a success story. She's a big personality and she got a chant going that the people enjoy. Britt's also getting over with the heel promos, as we've already talked about, the only problem there being that we currently have a monster heel champion. Shida is still over even though she gets beaten all the time, and the recent B. Priestley stuff seems to be going in an interesting direction. It's taken about a year, but AEW seems to be moving in the right direction with its women's division. But the company is still in need of a female megastar, especially when WWE's crowning jewel over the last 2 years and the only star they have consistently booked properly is a woman, who outshines everyone else on their roster. But ultimately, I don't think the AEW women's division was as bad as people said it was ever, and I think it's getting better moving forward. So to conclude, the women need more mic time, and everything else should fall into place from there. But besides the issues with the women's division, AEW has 2 big problems in my opinion. 2 that you probably don't even think are issues, but I think are pretty big ones. And they are 2 big individual topics. One about Kenny Omega that we'll get to at the end of the video, and one about MJF that we'll get into right now. Strap yourselves in for these ones, as we will go to some weird places to make our point. As kayfabe has increasingly died with the inception of the internet, the wrestling audience, especially the hardcore wrestling audience, has changed. And this weird meta-narrative state that the hardcore wrestling fans dwell in has led to some weird, never-before-seen phenomena, and the most interesting and fascinating of these oddities is fake heat. This to me is when a smart audience opts to act like a mark audience and boo the heel/heels because they respect their heel work so much, knowing that it's all part of the show. This phenomenon is so many levels deep in this fucked up wrestling metatext that it's hard to comprehend. But this was birthed in NXT actually, with the Revival. Initially the Revival's push in NXT was immediate, and outside of Full Sail, the people really weren't behind it. They didn't exist, and then suddenly they beat the Vaudevillains and they were the tag team champions. They didn't even win the belts at a takeover, but at a Full Sail taping, meaning that it was leaked long before it could air on NXT TV. The people in Full Sail seemed to get it, but with the Revival's first defense of their championships at TakeOver London against the monstrously over Enzo and Cass, it was obvious that the heels were going to get booed that night. But alas, the match happens, Enzo and Cass don't win, the Revival escape with their belts, but the talking points coming out of that match in the hardcore wrestling community, which was the NXT audience at the time, was that somehow the Revival was so good they carried Enzo and Cass to a great match, which won them quite a bit of favour with this audience. But still, many people were unfamiliar with them and thought better teams deserved the tag title, so the boos was still genuine at that point. But the next match they had against another monstrously over tag team in American Alpha changed this forever. This match was so great that everyone knew who both teams were now, and everyone loved the Revival in the online wrestling community. Enzo and Cass was them coming out, and this match proved that it wasn't a fluke and that they really were this good. They lost the titles in that match, but they went on to win them back from American Alpha, as they were due for a call-up to SmackDown in another fantastic match, getting them over more with the audiences that were watching them. But they continued to be booed. The Revival then went on to have their now iconic feud with DIY, cementing them as probably the best tag team in the world, but again, the arenas of smart fans that actually love the Revival booed them because they understood that the Revival outside of kayfabe wanted the audience to boo them, so they played along. It's a recognition of you're so good, we'll pretend to be stupid, so the atmosphere of this match more fits the story you want to be told. Now this may sound like a crackpot theory to someone unfamiliar with this story, but I know this is a fact because of the Revival's last match with NXT. The last NXT match the Revival had as full-time members of the developmental roster was a three-way against DIY and the Authors of Pain, and while there were some cheers for the Revival as it became obvious AOP was supposed to be the big heels in the match, the Revival was still largely booed. The audience was still playing along, only for them to come up to the main roster 2 days later on the Raw after WrestleMania and get a monster babyface reaction from the same fans in the same building as they beat up the New Day, who at that point were still monster babyfaces in their own right. And sure, some of it was the call-up pop, but on the main roster it became, these are our NXT guys and we love them, let's not hide it anymore because we don't respect the WWE main roster product as much, so let our true feelings be shown. The Revival never had heat with anyone, really. The audience would boo them in the arenas and then praise them endlessly on social media and in YouTube videos, and podcasts and the such. And the reason I've outlined their entire trajectory through NXT is to show that this exists. Fake heat is real, and is something hardcore wrestling audiences do, and it would later go on to be applied to other NXT guys as well, most notably Tommaso Ciampa, who the hardcores would boo in the arenas and then praise online for his great heel work and his feud against Johnny Gargano. Because again, they understood what was trying to be achieved with the storyline and wanted to actively help, by acting the way they thought they were expected to act. And this same thing is happening with MJF and AEW. MJF has fake heat, and it is a problem if he and the company aren't aware of it. This was a problem with Tommaso Ciampa as well. You can't get heat with a hardcore wrestling base. In fact, I don't even think heat is valuable in the modern wrestling age, much less a money draw. Originally in wrestling, heat was supposed to exist not only as a storytelling technique to have a good guy and a bad guy in a match, that part is actually still relevant today, but to get the fans so mad at a certain wrestler that they would pay money to see them potentially get their comeuppance. This may have worked when the secret wasn't out, but this is impossible in wrestling today, and especially in AEW, because of their largely hardcore audience. That's why I think the mass amount of praise for MJF are just marks from the business jerking themselves off. No one is going to buy an AEW ticket to see MJF get beaten up. The target audience of AEW is the hardcore wrestling fans, who know that wrestling is fake and that MJF is just a character. Sure, MJF may have heat with the kids that watch AEW, who don't know any better, but the kids aren't the ones buying tickets. People will buy an AEW ticket to see AEW, just like in WWE where people buy tickets to see the WWE. Everyone in AEW before AEW existed did not draw like AEW. It is in AEW's marketing that it has created a ticket-selling monster. AEW's biggest achievement seems to be its ticket sales, and it's achieved this by marketing itself as the opposite of the WWE and a haven for the hardcore and lapsed wrestling fans. Their ratings are still lower than TNA at certain points of its run, and people were complaining back then in this community, I remember, how awful it was for TNA to only be drawing 1 million viewers. Oh, how things have changed in this poor little community. But somehow they are selling tickets like hotcakes, and it's not because MJF has heat, it's because the brand is over just like the WWE. All these stars couldn't sell out the Cow Palace on top, with all the New Japan stars helping them, but they can now because of what the people think this company represents. But again, I think the examples of what AEW is trying to do and what NXT is trying to do with heat are only achieved by New Japan in this wrestling world. Bullet Club has massive heat in Japan, particularly Kenta and Jay White, and this is real heat. The people in Japan despise these two men and probably would pay to see Naito beat the shit out of them. We know this because Kenta and Naito just sold 10,000 tickets in Osaka-jo Hall built on Kenta's heat from the Tokyo Dome. But that's because the Japanese wrestling culture and the Japanese crowds are so different. There are a lot more women and children in New Japan audiences than there are in Western wrestling audiences, and they don't seem to have the same smarky issues all the Western wrestling promotions have to face, especially since that's all that's basically left as WWE has bled away the wrestling base since Austin and Rock left. Japanese fans aren't infested with this smarky bullshit that AEW cannot escape, mostly because they profit off of it since their audience is almost entirely smarks. So to conclude, MJF has fake heat and is not the greatest heel ever, because he only gets that reaction because people are willingly playing along with him. This isn't MJF's fault, he's done nothing wrong, he plays the role great. A little too reliant on cheap heat for me, but he's obviously great. But if AEW thinks he's going to move business, I think they're misunderstanding the type of heat he has, and that could obviously be a problem. So let's move out of this controversial MJF topic into the possibly even more controversial AEW has wasted Kenny Omega topic. Again, I believe that AEW and the initial interest in a possible Western wrestling alternative was born in New Japan and its rising popularity in the West, which started with things like AJ Styles becoming a big player in New Japan and the Okada and Tanahashi feud that the most hardcore of the hardcore wrestling community went on continuously about, and could even be traced back to the Tanahashi vs Suzuki match in 2012 that main evented King of Pro Wrestling, as it was one of the first pay-per-views New Japan made available in 2 English-speaking audiences. But let's not get it twisted, everything exploded when Kenny Omega and Okada got 6 stars from Meltzer and Twitter exploded, which led to Reddit exploding, which led to more Western interest in what was happening in New Japan Pro Wrestling. This all directly led to Jericho getting involved, and then baby, we're off to the races. But the important part here is that all of the guys that founded AEW, like the Bucks and Cody, and the other Ring of Honor guys like the Hangman and SCU, had all been on Western TV wrestling shows before, for years, and hadn't made an AEW level impact. But the New Japan guys hadn't gotten this opportunity yet, and most notably the presumed best wrestler in the world and AEW's biggest signee, Kenny Omega, had never gotten that opportunity yet. My interest, besides general curiosity in AEW, was that Kenny Omega is one of the best wrestlers in the world who just had another 6-star match with Tanahashi in the main event of the Tokyo Dome, so I at least have to see what he's doing since it doesn't look like he'll be working with New Japan anymore. I feel like most people felt like this. Kenny Omega was the only person from New Japan that was going over to AEW, besides the best friends, and no offense, but whatever. And that's where this revolution, if that's what you want to call it, started, in New Japan. But at least in my opinion, AEW completely fumbled Kenny Omega. After winning him away from his home in New Japan and fighting off what I understand were massive offers from the WWE, Kenny Omega comes out of the Tokyo Dome a loser but one of the hottest wrestlers in the world, and then doesn't have a match of note until May, 4 months later when he's considerably cooled off. And then the match with Jericho underwhelms to say the least. It was nowhere near as good as their match in the Tokyo Dome, and Omega lost again. This definitely cooled him off, and then he becomes basically a feature wrestler without a story as he's put in matches against guys like Chima that are supposed to be exciting because they'll be good matches, and they are fine, but who cares? And then he starts jobbing to Pac because this was the period where the Elite thought they had to do jobs to everyone, and Jericho was the only one that was protected, and it was just misstep after misstep after misstep, to the point where now Kenny Omega is still unbelievably over, but it's more like a legacy pop. Hey, it's Kenny Omega, remember all the great matches he had in Japan? Is what they are saying while they point at the guy next to him who's way cooler and way more over, chugging beer and not giving a fuck. What happened to the cleaner? What happened to the Terminator-looking fuck who debuted to confront Taguchi? What happened to the cringy yet endearing over-the-top promos? That Kenny Omega is gone, and now we're left with a boring babyface who has good matches, but is outshunned by his tag partner and guys like Cody and Jericho, when by all accounts he should have been the biggest star in this company, the company that he's directly most responsible for, and that's where the solution comes in. Kenny Omega must turn heel and kill the Hangman. Kenny Omega needs to be AEW's biggest heel. He needs to kill Moxley, he needs to take that belt. If Jericho wasn't the best thing in AEW TV last year, I'd say retroactively that it was a tragedy that Omega didn't immediately win the belt as it was created. Kenny really hasn't had a proper feud in AEW yet, and this potential one with the Hangman, where everyone expects the Hangman to turn on him, would be exactly what he needs to remind us who we should be thanking for all of this, for this place existing. No, that Moxley feud where they hated each other for no reason and no one knew who to cheer, that culminated in terrible hardcore nonsense, doesn't count, and neither does that Pac feud that had no reason to exist and was boring. We need a proper Kenny Omega feud with a storyline like Jericho vs Moxley or Cody vs MJF, and we need it now. And this is an opportunity with the Hangman to take them both to the next level in AEW. And he's about the only man Kenny could turn on and actually get heat against. And that's my hot take on Kenny Omega in AEW. So to conclude, the Young Bucks versus Kenny Omega and the Hangman tag match was great. The tease that the Hangman was going to buckshot that prick into the stratosphere was great. That Jake the Snake promo was great. Really, all the promos are great, but they may have fumbled Kenny Omega at a time when the world was his, MJF has fake heat, and the women's division needs some work, but is getting there. Kiss my ass, why hasn't Hiromu vs. Naito happened yet? Give me money on Patreon if you want more wrestling content. Support links in the description below. Thanks.